morning we did a lot of talking at you and encouraging from the perspective of where we've been in 2019 and setting the focus for 2020. And this afternoon we're going to get a little bit more specific about what are some of the underpinnings of the things that we are doing carrying us into 2019. Comparing us to other jurisdictions is not the leading cause or purpose of what we're doing. It is an opportunity for us to see nationally what the field of child welfare is doing and how Connecticut and the families of Connecticut are poised to be able to move in that direction. We also have an opportunity to make sure that our vision is focused. Is anybody else focused with me? I'm looking. Anybody else focused with me? To kick off the information from this afternoon, Jodi's going to introduce our kind of virtual keynote and the video that you're about to see and why we chose this particular speech to demonstrate for you some of the underpinnings of the work that we're doing. So Jodi, can you go ahead?
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. I have to tell you, this morning was absolutely amazing. It was amazing to be in your presence. It's amazing to feel your energy, and amazing to really look forward to the future. You are the future, and I feel so confident and enthused and excited about what you all are going to do in these next coming years. As you all know, we had this forum. It was a half-day forum for the community providers, and that went over really well. And one of the things that was like really, I think, paradigm shifting for a lot of our providers who were in the room was the Jerry Milner video. So, in case you don't know, the Children's Bureau is almost like we have a commissioner for the state of Connecticut. He's almost like the commissioner over child welfare for the United States. And so they oversee our work and provide standards of practices and hold us accountable to those standards of practice. But much like there's passion and there's purpose and there's pride, with our commissioner, this commissioner has the same kind of purpose and pride and passion, and he understands the need to partner. I'm talking about Dr. Jerry Milner, who you're going to see in the film. What I appreciated about this film is that in the film he's talking to judicial folks, our judges. Some of our judges were there, our court staff, so on and so forth. And I'm going to add another P to what he did. He was actually provocative. He was very provocative. In the room there were foster care agencies and judges, and we all know that they shape this work as well, right? And so what happens when you have the Associate Commissioner of the Children's Bureau talk about kids need to not be in foster care to a foster care agency? And when you're talking to judges, talking about, you play a key role. If you're acting antithetical to what we're trying to do nationally and in Connecticut, it's not going to work. So it was a tough conversation, so I would add provocative to that. Many people found that video sort of mind-shifting. But I want to tell you a little bit about Jerry Milner. First of all, what I want you to know about Jerry Milner is that Jerry Milner is a social worker. Jerry Milner is a social worker. All right. Jerry Milner is a politician. He works, he's appointed and all that, but Jerry Milner is a social worker. So when he talks, I've known Jerry for a very, very long time, and so he comes to this work with a child protection service lens. He ran he was the commissioner, director of the Alabama state system. So he knows what it's like. He knows what it's like to move kids and the difficulties and the intricacies of the job that we have to do. So he has that line experience. He also worked for the Center for Support of Families, and he actually spent some time in Connecticut working with us and helping us to get our PIP to fruition. And before that, He was over the Child and Family Services Review process, the CFSR process. And that's actually where I got to know Jerry. He helped to implement the very first round of that. So he knows where the federal government was going and what they were trying to do. And after he left there, he opened up the center to help states actually pass their PIPs, and he helped us pass our PIP. So we were thrilled to see that it was Jerry Milner who was coming back to run the Children's Bureau. And why were we excited? Because, as I said, he knows the work, he knows our challenges, and I was thinking about the flip chart over there when they were saying, you know, we have the consent decree, we have the CFSR, we have all those things that are pushing us, right? I want you to know that the person who is over the Children's Bureau has just as much passion and purpose and pride for the children and families that we serve. So look at this video and understand that even we are in excellent hands. When I tell you, I have never in my 31 years of child welfare experience been more excited than now, because of who's at the top on a federal level. It makes a difference. Somebody who knows our work. And so we're going to show you, we're going to cue up the video so that you can see this is the video that was shown to our community providers.
Some tough questions about what our child welfare system is set up to do. At this very moment, over 60% of children in foster care are there as a result of neglect, not physical or sexual abuse. And we know that in many cases, neglect is associated with poverty. How often as a field have we confused poverty for neglect? Are we truly committed to keeping vulnerable families together? And why are we so willing to pay for kids to be cared for under another family's roof instead of investing in that child's own family? What if, instead, we put our money towards supporting families and keeping children safely under their own roofs? As a system, we pay for foster care or we pay for therapy to address the damage that is done to children by removal, rather than investing in families and ensuring they have the supports they need to succeed. My firm belief is that we have many, many children in foster care right now who could remain safely with their parents if their families were able to get the support and the services they need in order to care for their children in safe ways. We have a tremendous opportunity to come together to create a joint vision of how we can support families across systems, mitigate vulnerabilities, enhance protective factors, and make sure children and families have the basic, concrete supports to
What's
keep them
happening?
strong
What's happening to the
and
video?
allow them to thrive. I strongly believe that we can and that we must.
You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared for technical. I'm about to get dizzy. Turn it off. Turn it off. Wait, you know what? You always have to be prepared for technical difficulties, don't you? Well, in this case, it's not technical difficulty because we have the real Jerry Milner in the house. Please, everybody, stand and welcome the Associate Commissioner of Children's Bureau, Dr. Jerry Milner.
When we were calling, we were saying to Jerry's assistant, okay, this is what we want to do. So thank you for being Thank you very much.
Oh, you guys are too nice. So. I hope you'll stand up when I'm done. You will, because you'll be glad to see me go. Never had an introduction quite like that ever before, but it's a treat. It's a treat to be here with all of you. Just such a pleasure. I've had the opportunity through the years in other roles that I've been in to do a fair amount of work up here in Connecticut. Just about everybody I worked with during that time has moved on, but some key people are still around, and I actually look forward to the opportunity to work with so many of you as time goes on. Thank you once again for having us. up here. I want to start out by saying, we've been on a mission in the Children's Bureau for about 3 years now to really change the face of child welfare as we've done it throughout the years. And a big part of that mission and the activities associated with that had been spending time with parents and young adults who have lived experience in the child welfare system. This trip up here is one of only just a handful of trips that we've made over the last 3 years where we haven't specifically said we want to sit down with parents who've been a part of the system, or we want to sit down with young people who have been in the foster care system and just hear what they have to say, because their voices are critically important to us. It's the experiences that they have in the child welfare system, quite honestly, for me, are my primary measures of success or failure in what it is that we do. I am a data-driven person, but I am far more interested in the voices of those people whose lives we affect every day. So every time we give a little bit of a talk like this, we start out by just trying to bring home what some of those voices might be. I'm joined today with my policy advisor, Jeremy Long, who works really closely with me to make sure that the voices of people with lived experience are incorporated into everything that we do. So before I get too deep into what I want to share with you today, I'm going to ask Jeremy to come up just for a minute and lead us just through a little bit of thinking about how those voices affect our work. So Jeremy?
I guess I get to be the opening act for the opening act. So thank you so much for having us. Unlike Jerry, this is my first time in Connecticut, so thank you very much for the warm welcome. Minus the little bit of cold, but DC's not any better, so, and I think you guys actually got less snow. But like Jerry mentioned, for the past 3 years we've been traveling the country, and like him, one of my priorities is very much focused on listening to the voices of the families and the children that we affect. One thing personally about me is I am an alumni of this system, so it's very much exciting to hear a commissioner and somebody at such a federal level actually care and listen to the families and children of those in our foster care system and actually do something about the experiences that they have. So one of the things I just want you to humor me with real quick is just to take about 30 seconds and I don't think we spend a lot of time on this, but we know what the children and families that we serve actually think about their experiences with us, right? So take about 30 seconds, just think about one word, and then I'm going to ask a few volunteers just to scream them out. Well, maybe not scream, but shout them out. So think long and hard. All right, if you're ready, let me have
Unfair.
unfair,
Complicated.
complicated,
Terrifying.
terrifying.
Pain.
I heard 3. Pain,
Confusion.
confusion,
Never ending.
never ending,
Loss.
lost. How do those unsupported, trapped,
Judged.
trust, judged,
Policy.
policy. Not exactly. Fantastic? Can I meet the children and families that you work with? So not overwhelmingly positive words, right? And these are the experiences that our children, youth, and families face every single day dealing with the systems that we work so hard to make better for them. So now just take 10, 15 seconds to think about the words you want those children, youth, and families to use when they express their experiences with us. Healing. Hope.
Empowered.
Empowered. Loved. Caring.
Helpful.
Happiness. Family support. Fair. Sense of belonging. The chance.
Just.
Fantastic, absolutely.
Helpful.
Hopeful. Helped. Relieved. What was the one over here?
Connected.
Connected. And respected. I think that's my new tagline, connected and respected. So why can't we have those words be the experiences of the children and families that we serve every day? right? Think long and hard about that. That's exactly the type of system that we as a country need. And we need a joint vision in order to get there. And I'm excited that Jerry's going to share that vision with you. And I again thank you for humoring me for a little bit, and we'll welcome back to the stage Jerry Milner.
Thanks, Jeremy. I hope you get a sense, and I don't think we're trying to put thoughts in your minds that you don't have every day out in the field doing the work that you're doing, but we do want to make sure that we center that kind of thinking around a changed child welfare system in our country. When I talk about this, I'm quite well aware that I make a hell of a lot of people mad. People who don't want to change or who may not think we need to change dramatically and who in some situations have different values than I have around what a child and family well-being system can actually be in our country, as opposed to an almost exclusive child protection system that often occurs or operates at the expense of child and family well-being. So I don't go around talking about how do we improve a system that I think is fundamentally flawed. I want to turn the whole darn thing upside down on its ear, and I want us to rethink about how we can reimagine the way that we interact with children and families, and get that second set of words that comes to our mind that would reflect their experience. Jodi and I were talking a little bit before I came in here. Again, I'm well aware that when I start talking, I make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. I think that's good, because I think that as a system in our country, if we're comfortable with those kinds of words that children and families use to describe their experiences in child welfare, we've got a really big problem, and we have to get uncomfortable if we want to change that experience and change those words that we hear. I believe, I've worked in the field, I hope Jodi doesn't know this to tell you, but 45 years now. Started out as a caseload carrying social worker, was a county supervisor, child welfare director in another state before doing the kind of work at the federal level that I'm doing right now. And I give myself license to criticize a system that I think doesn't get us the outcomes that we want for children and families. And I think that the trajectory that we're on as a child welfare system in our country is unsustainable. And I don't think I can, in good conscience, keep the job that I have. I may not be able to keep the job that I have. But even want to keep the job if I don't think about, talk about, promote different ways of doing our work with children and families. There are a few clear indicators to me that our current trajectory is unsustainable. The fact that we now have 437,000 children in foster care is a big indicator to me that is not a system that we can continue to grow and grow and grow. I will say that as of 2018, it's the first time in 6 or 7 years that we've begun to see some leveling off in that. That is good news. I'm waiting for that trend to turn downward and for children to remain safe while that turns downward before I declare any sort of trend or victory there. 75% of the founded reports of child abuse and neglect in our country every year are not from abuse of any kind. It's from what? Neglect. And as many as 2/3 of those reports of child abuse, of neglect that we get, of those founded reports, are somehow traceable back to poverty. The fact that their parents are unable to meet the basic needs of their children and the rising escalation of circumstances that results from that often leads families to the front door of the Child Welfare Agency. Until we are able to deal with that as a root cause of so much of child welfare involvement, we're going to continue to see those families, and we're going to continue to see traumatized children come before us in our child welfare system. I know that you know this in Connecticut because I've heard people here talk about it for many, many years. We struggle with tremendous issues of racial, ethnic disparity and disproportionality in our child welfare system. We haven't figured out yet how to deal with that. We also know that every time we separate a child from the parents, that is a traumatic experience. Even when it's necessary to protect the safety of that child, it's a traumatic experience, and it adds to the trauma and the intergenerational trauma in many situations that our families experience. In too many places in our country, we remove kids from their parents as our primary intervention, and we ask questions later. We've gotten too comfortable as a country in placing children with strangers, people that they don't know. I know that here in Connecticut, you've got closing on to half of you kids in foster care with relatives. I applaud you for doing that. Yep, that's a great indicator. But still, even in those situations, I believe in child welfare, our child welfare practice, that we continue to fail many of those families by not asking basic questions like, what is it that you need? What can we do to create the conditions where you can have what you need to keep your kids safe and for your family to thrive? We talk about doing it, but it's not thoroughly integrated into the way that we do our work. On the court side, and I don't know if we have court people here or not, but we fail children and families when we don't make reasonable efforts to prevent removal of children from their parents and to finalize those permanency plans once they come into the foster care system. That reasonable efforts requirement, 9 times out of 10, in my experience, I hope yours is different, is not anything more than a check mark on a pre-printed court order designed to make sure that a child remains eligible for Title IV-E federal foster care payments, regardless of what substantive efforts have been made. And when we do that, when we say that we've made those efforts, and when somebody checks that box and they have not been made, we are complicit in adding to the trauma that family has already experienced. And we have got to move away from that kind of an approach in the child welfare system. We need to get out of the trauma creating and trauma fixing business and into the trauma prevention business. And make no doubt about it, when Jeremy and I and one of our other colleagues meet with these young adults, sometimes 2 or 3 times every month, we hear the evidence of the trauma that they've experienced in the foster care system in the name of protecting them and protecting their physical safety. Recently, just as an example, I met with a group of young people, probably about a dozen or 15 of them in a room, just to hear what they had to say, to give me input on how we can do better by them in the child welfare system. They started going around this horseshoe-shaped table introducing themselves, and I was shocked, although I didn't think much of anything would shock me anymore, when they began introducing themselves and says, my name is, I was in foster care for this long, and I was in this many placements. That's how they identified themselves to me. We went around the room. The first young man said, my name's Josh. I was in foster care for 17 years. I was in 17 different placements. My name's Matt. I was in foster care for 18 years and 18 different placements. On around the room, 12 years, 21 different placements. More kids than not had grown up in that child welfare system. We got all the way around the table. The last young woman said, my name is Shay, and that is her real name. I've been in foster care I was in foster care for 17 years. I was in 45 different placements. The fact that they can say that to me so matter-of-factly and use that to describe who they are should be shocking. It is shocking to me. It should be shocking to all of us. I told that story a couple of weeks afterwards at a huge meeting. And afterwards, another young woman came up to me with tears in her eyes, actually. And she said, I'm glad you're highlighting that issue. She said, I was in foster care for 12 years. I was in 88 different placements. Think about it. 12 years times 12 months, 144 months, 88 different placements means approximately every month and a half she had to pack up what she had, leave friends if she was fortunate enough to make friends, change schools most of the time, go to a new place, try to get established, only a month and a half later on average to pick up and move again. Every one of those moves was a loss for that child. Every one of those moves heaped on the trauma, probably in ways that might not have ever occurred had she remained in her family situation. I don't know what her family situation was. But I do know that we did not alleviate the trauma that she experienced. We added to that. And each one of those moves makes it increasingly difficult for those young people to adjust, to be healthy, to thrive, to take care of themselves in a world that is very often quite inhospitable to them. So many of the young people that I know are able to deal with that trauma, able to deal with that situations, even become advocates. I am probably friends with about 200 to 300 of those young people on Facebook. And that's how I stay in touch with them. And they tell me what their experiences are. And there's probably not a single day that goes by, whether I'm speaking to a group or not, that I'm not in contact with one of those young adults. And I know that while so many of them have incredible resiliency, even those who appear to be doing well are carrying around a weight of trauma that every day of their lives they have to deal with. And I also know that so many of those young people are not even able to give the appearance of doing well because they haven't yet been able to stabilize themselves and deal with the most fundamental things like having a home to live in, having a job, being able to get the education that will open so many doors for them. So I have to ask, how well are we protecting kids when we bring them into those kinds of situations and expose them to those circumstances? And how well are we protecting kids when we let them age out of the foster care system without having permanency in their lives? Most of those young people around that table did not have permanency in their lives. They did not have the opportunity to reunify, to get permanent placement through relatives, experience a guardianship or adoption. These young people were finding their way in the world pretty much on their own. I find it unacceptable that we ever let a child age out of our foster care system. We give it a fancy name. We call it emancipation. That's the goal. It makes us feel better. It's an official goal. Federal government says you can do that. It just simply means we're cutting a child loose without having the kinds of permanency and the kinds of connections. We've got an entire program, frankly a program that I like, the Chafee Independence Program, but it's based on the premise that kids are going to age out of the foster care system. And that should not be something that we accept as inevitable. I don't think that it is inevitable. I find it unconscionable that we have a system. This is not an indictment of you. It's not an indictment of me, but we have a child welfare system here that's based on those kinds of values that says we're going to have kids who age out of the foster care system, or kids that have to stay in a foster care system for 18 years of their lives. We implicitly accept the fact that 18, 21, ever how many moves is a part of that experience. And we have to change that value if we want our system to change. A lot of people out there say our child welfare system is broken. I was reading news clippings, which I'm so hard trying to get out of the habit of doing, but reading news clippings on the train within the last day or two, and it's talking about a different state and the child welfare system is broken. And I'm saying, no, it's not broken. Our system is set up to do exactly what it was designed to do. Separate children and families, and to unintentionally, I have to say, inflict so much difficulty on the lives of children and families. I think we can do better than that. And I would not be standing in front of you if I didn't think you also think we can do better than that as a child welfare system. Our children, our families, deserve a hell of a lot better than what we as a national child welfare system are able to give them. I believe that we can work together to strengthen families, to reduce unnecessary parent-child separation, to disentangle poverty and neglect. Do you know all of the social issues that we're dealing with out there as a society become amplified in the child welfare system? Poverty, oppression, disproportionate challenges for people of color, disconnected youth, they're all magnified in our current child welfare system, yet so often those are not the core issues that we choose to deal with as a system, or to set our system up to deal with those kinds of issues. As long as we're getting the kinds of outcomes that we're getting right now, which are not good, in my opinion, as long as the majority of the faces of children and families in our child welfare system are black, brown, or poor and white, which they are, we don't have a system that's creating justice for those families. And we have to be about that. We have to reimagine what we can be in the lives of children and families, and how we can support them as they move forward with the goal of thriving. It's not too much to ask that we help families to thrive so that their children can thrive. So, with all of that lofty preaching, I want to get down to a little bit of substance. I think there's two broad ways that we can begin to reimagine that kind of a child welfare system. The very first thing that we must work together to do is to reduce the need for families to ever make contact with the child welfare system. We have a reactive child welfare system. You know, when do you get involved with a family? I hear a lot of You get involved in the family when the call comes into your hotline. When somebody says this child's in danger, this child's been abused, this child's been neglected. In many situations, probably most situations, it's not the first time. And when we start to look into it, we have to be darn sure that that child's been harmed before we'll do anything. And we got to be darn sure that they've been harmed enough for us to do anything to offer services and supports to the families. I don't think that perpetuates a sense of well-being among our families and among our children. I don't think that helps to break intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect and trauma and difficulty in our families. Yet that's the way our system is set up to operate. It's certainly the way it's funded to operate. And at the federal level, I got more beefs at the federal level than I do at the state level. That's what we fund you to do. We fund you to place kids in foster care. 90% of the budget that I have has to go to that. So I'm grateful, even though I don't think Family First is the end-all or the be-all, just putting my cards on the table right there. It does fill an important gap, and it does allow the federal government to help you to offer some support to prevent children from entering foster care under certain circumstances. But I think we have to do more than that. We have to go further upstream to primary prevention of child abuse and neglect if we truly want to strengthen the capacity of parents to care for their children in safe and healthy ways. This offends a lot of people, particularly in states that are strapped for foster homes. I'm not ever going to be the person who's out there rallying for more foster homes. It's not the mission that I'm on. And quite honestly, I don't believe we need more foster homes. I believe we need services, programs, conditions in place that prevent the need for children to be placed in a foster home. And until we get to that point and we start to address those fundamental prevention areas in the lives of our children and families, we're always going to be chasing our tails trying to get more foster homes so that we can place more children in a foster care system. There are ways that we can prevent the need for families to come into contact with the child welfare system. One of them is by listening to families, hearing what they have to tell us. There's tremendous wisdom in the voices of parents who've experienced the child welfare system. We may not agree with all the choices that they've made, and many of the families that were in my caseload often made bad choices, made uninformed choices, things they shouldn't have done. But their experiences include so much wisdom and so much learning that we can do if we listen to them and respond, as Jeremy said, to what those voices are telling us. We can do that by creating networks of primary prevention supports in the communities where children and parents live. I can't tell you how often parents tell me about having to go miles and miles in multiple forms of transportation and take off work that they can't afford to do to get an hour of counseling somewhere that may not be what they need in the first place, and sometimes may be canceled after they spend a half a day trying to get there for it. We shouldn't be doing that kind of work. We need supports in the communities where children and parents live. We need to build those conditions that will provide them the supports that they need when adversity strikes, as it inevitably will in their lives, just like it inevitably does in our lives as well. Even if formal services are not available out there, and I hear all the time from judges, from agencies, we can't do this, we can't do that, because we don't have enough services to accommodate the need out there. Frankly, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Because I don't believe that there's a county or a significant geographical area out there that does not have some combination of a school, churches, health departments, Head Start centers, medical facilities, civic organizations that with some leadership and vision could become the foundation for a community-based prevention network. We need to take advantage of those kinds of systems, those kinds of networks that are out there. In spite of that, we are hell-bent on trying to find more and more evidence-based practices to treat the pathology that often translates to vulnerability among many of our families. When a parent cannot take care of their children because they don't have enough money to give them stable housing or to put food on the table or get them into the doctor, they're not going to benefit from some sort of clinical mental health intervention. We've got to look at some of the fundamental needs that parents have. But that requires us as a society and as a child welfare system to understand and to value parents, even those parents who may not have all the curb appeal that we'd like for them to have. We've got to value that parent-child relationship as opposed to only valuing the rescue of children. And we've got an opportunity to really seriously think about that. How can we strengthen not just the resiliency of our kids, but of their parents? Because we can't see our children out of the context of the families that they're born in. Even understanding, as I well do as a social worker, that some children out there will never be able to live safely with their children. But I also believe that among that approximate 60% of kids that we bring into foster care in our country every year due to neglect, that we have a tremendous opportunity to think about what it is that we could have done to prevent those parents from ever having contact with the child welfare system. So the second thing that I think we can do in this whole reimagination journey is for those families that must be involved in child welfare despite our best efforts. For those children who must be served in foster care despite our best efforts, we have to dramatically change that experience. I don't ever want to sit in another room, although I will, and hear a young adult say, matter-of-factly, I was in foster care for 12 years and in 45 different placements. We can act to change that experience for kids who are in our foster care system. One of the things that I feel incredibly strongly about is that in pursuit of that goal, is that every child and every parent who's in our child welfare system should have high quality, adequate legal representation in court. Too many times I hear parents say, my voice was never heard. Too many times I hear young adults say, I met my lawyer 5 minutes ago before we walked into the courtroom here. Their voices are not being heard. Their desires, their wishes, their goals for themselves are not being made known to the courts. And we've got to change that. We changed our policy at the federal level a few months ago to allow federal Title 40 administrative funds to be able to use to support the cost of legal representation for children and parents so that they have a fair shake in our system and that their voices are heard. Another way we can change that experience, a lot of foster parents many of whom I love because of the work that they do and because I know them, don't like to hear me say this. But foster care needs to be a support for an entire family, not just a substitute for a parent. We need to get to the point in our work, in our system, where the expectation of caregivers coming into the system is that this is what the job is. We work with parents. I know that for years, and I'm guilty of having done it a long time ago, we try to protect our foster parents because we don't want to lose them. We're desperate to have those places for kids to stay. So we don't want to ruffle any feathers. We don't want to say, you got to do this, you got to go above and beyond. But that's not serving children and families in the way that they need to be served in our child welfare system. And there are programs out there that are operating where foster care is a support for the entire families. We need to learn from those programs. We need to emulate that in the work that we're doing and to make sure that they are supporting a child within the context of their entire family. We can change that experience by normalizing as much as possible parent-child interactions while a child is in the foster care system. It troubles my heart greatly every time I meet with a group of parents and they say, Will, I get to see my child, on Monday afternoon from this hour to this hour at the office or at a visitation center. It troubles me when I go to agencies or courts and they say, we always start out with supervised visitation, and then the parents have to earn unsupervised visitation or a little bit longer time with their children. How in the world do we expect to protect parent-child relationships and bonds when that's the kind of interaction that they have in a child welfare system? That happens. I don't know what happens in Connecticut. You do, but I don't know. But I talk to parents across the country on a routine basis, and that's a very familiar refrain from those. We have to change that. I met, I am going to. I'm conscious of my time, Jodi, but I do want, it's the experiences that they have that are a better spokesperson for the vision that we have than anything that I can come up with. I met a number of years ago, a foster parent, a birth parent, and 3 children who were in a foster care system in a neighborhood-based foster care program. When those 3 children had to come into the foster care system because of serious substance abuse by their single mother, the agency, instead of placing them a county over, a neighborhood over, 25 miles away, placed them in a foster home that was literally just right down the street, which meant those kids did not have to change schools. They were all school-age kids. They didn't have to lose contact with everything that was familiar to them. And they were able to interact with their mother, even though they could not live safely under the roof with her during that period of time, were able to interact with her on a regular basis. From the beginning of the placement of those 3 children in that foster home, the foster mother made it very clear to the birth mother, I expect you to be here at this hour to help me get the kids ready for bed. I expect you to be here in the morning to help me get them dressed and walk them to school. When they have events, athletic events, school events, I'll expect you to be there with me. Those kids were in the foster care system for over 2 years, during which time the mom had probably more than one relapse, more than one failure in her efforts to get substance abuse treatment. But throughout that time, they were able to maintain the integrity of that critical relationship. The foster mother was always there, supporting the mom, encouraging her, keeping her hope alive by encouraging and allowing her to be in that kind of regular contact with her children. And those 2 years that those kids spent in foster care, let me tell you, was a different experience than 2 years in foster care that any child I ever worked with had, because they were able to maintain that relationship. And when the day came that those 3 kids were able to be successfully reunified with their mother, they walked back up the street. And at that point, the roles were reversed. The foster mother became a support to this mother. She was the one now coming into the home at night to help them with their homework. She was the one helping the mom in the morning to get them ready for school. She was the one there to encourage and to help that mother realize that she had the capacity to care for those children. She was a support for that mom who otherwise would have been incredibly socially isolated and at tremendous risk of falling into patterns that led to her children coming into the foster care system in the first place. We can have that kind of a foster care system. I'm absolutely confident of it. I can tell you a county up in Michigan right now where they have precisely that kind of a foster care system that was initiated by the Foster Parent Association in that county, not by the agency. Foster parents had to bring the agency along with this, but they're committed to doing that work. And there are other incredible examples of that going on out there. I believe with all my heart that we can reimagine a child welfare system that protects children from threats to their safety, from harm, and also addresses their overall needs for well-being. I want to get to the point in our country where I sit with a group of young adults and who say, you know what, I'm doing well because of the foster care system, not in spite of the foster care system. In order to get to that point, I think we have to collectively commit ourselves to a child welfare system that truly values families. I hear people say it all the time, I value families, it's all in the mission statements and stuff like that, and the nice little frame things that we put up on the hallways. But when I look at the practice, it's not always there. And I think we think we're valuing families because inherently we value the concept of family. But it's difficult in the work that we do. It's difficult when we're afraid that we're going to be the next face in the newspaper because something went wrong. In order to reimagine a better child welfare system, we have to commit ourselves to a practice that is the right thing to do. And we can't swerve away from that when something bad happens, because something bad will happen. We're in the human behavior business. We can't control everything that's out there, but we can control our responses. And we can have a system that's grounded in fundamental values that are rooted in everything we know about brain science, about separation, about attachment, about the importance of relationships, and commit ourselves to doing that and stand by that when things go wrong, as hard as it is for us to do that at times. I want to work with you guys because the fact that you're here, the fact that you're coming together, I know you're coming together to talk about Family First. It's an incredible tool to move toward a prevention-based child welfare system. It's not the only tool that you need or that you will have to have, but the fact that you're here to begin that incredible journey is so encouraging to me. And I encourage you, as you think about Family First, don't think about, maybe a little bit, technical implementation of Family First. Think about how can we use those fundamental values to radically transform the kind of experience that our children and families need to have in Connecticut in our child welfare system. So thank you very, very much for letting me do that.
When I first heard the video that we referenced with Dr. Milner's speech, he ends it with the question of what if our system reflected our values? So when we saw Jeremy's exercise earlier and we yelled out those two different kind of paradigms, what if our system reflected our values? I've taken license and I've added, what if it already does? So unless we get real about our values, we can't turn our system to reflect the values that kids and families need. So we're going to kind of deviate a little bit from our prepared agenda just to allow us to talk freely about what this has meant. What will it take for us to really design a system to align with the values we say we have? Who wants to start? Stop being afraid. And also, too, as we make comments, if there are any questions for any of us or anything that we'd like to talk to each other about, let's use this as an opportunity to be able to do that. Dr. Milner is here with us, and we want to be able to take advantage of the opportunity that we have to have him in the room.
Mr. Milner, funding streams. When the foster parents were going back to work with the families, were they doing it out of the goodness of their heart, or was there some funding associated with it? Like 2 months of additional foster care payments or something?
You know, they're doing it because that's the expectation, and that's the role that they sign on to play. You can certainly disagree. Please do. Everybody else does. I think that's one of the parts of the vision that we have that doesn't, frankly, have to cost money. When I gave you that example of the 3 kids, that's a real life example. After I had the experience of talking with those individuals, I went back to the agency director, and I was just like, how do you do that? You know, how do you get foster parents to do that, to work with parents, including some parents who are often very hostile to them because you've got my kids now. And this Catholic sister who ran the agency up until her death a few years ago, she ran it for 40-something years, just looked at me with the most perplexed kind of look and said, it's our expectation. Pure and simple. And I said, well, no, wait, do you have to pay them more money? She said, we pay them what everybody else gets paid. I said, well, what about training? How do you train them to do it? She said, well, we give them some training, but it's the expectation. It's the way the agency is set up. I'll tell you, I went, just to tell you that is sustainable, that example goes back 25 years ago. The first time I visited with that particular agency. And when I got this job, about 3 years ago, one of the first things I did was to go back and pay a visit to that agency again, because I wanted to see, was that just a passing thing? It's still the way that they're doing their work there. So I doubt I've answered your question satisfactorily, but no, we do not have funding to do that. But states are able to set what their foster care reimbursement rates are. The federal law does tell you what can go into those rates, but there's a wide divergence among states in terms of what we pay foster parents for the work, or how we reimburse foster parents for the work.
What else?
I think we need easy access to, a magnitude of community supports for these families. Many of them lack transportation. The ones who have transportation are like us, and they have full-time jobs, and it's not easy to leave your workplace to take care of your kids.
Absolutely.
So that sort of support.
I could not agree with you more. When I talk about primary prevention, I'm talking about creating those conditions out in communities where families have the opportunity to get the basic things that they need in order to not fall into such distress that would lead them to the doors of the Child Welfare Agency. I believe firmly, because I've spent 3 years going around the country looking at those programs, trying to understand how they work. Child Welfare Agency cannot do that alone, should not do it alone. We need to be a partner, but we have to mobilize the resources and the partnerships that exist out in communities. Those kinds of resources that families can trust to go to when they actually need some help. I don't know what your experience is here. I'm willing to bet not a whole bunch of families are going to walk up to the door of the Child Welfare Agency, knock and say, can I get some help? Maybe they are. I hope they are, Mr. Fantastic. I hope that they are. And they're getting a fantastic response when they do. But most of the families, when I talk to them, are afraid to ask for help. They're afraid to ask for help because they reveal their vulnerabilities, and they're afraid their kids are going to get taken away. And guess what? It happens. It happens. Within the last 6 months, I had a parent say exactly that to me. I was afraid to ask for help. Somebody talked me into asking for help. I went to the agency. I asked for help. They took my kids away from me. And so parents themselves, because of that fear, often let their circumstances become so dire. So I've deviated from your comment, but you could not be more on point. We have to have partnerships, whether it's with the private organizations, whether it's with the churches, the educational systems, the medical providers, those people in the community who can come together and contribute in whatever domain that they are a part of to the overall well-being of children and families. We put out near the end of 2018 an information memorandum on primary prevention. And in that information memorandum, we described many of the circumstances and many of the structures that were out there in the primary prevention programs that we've been able to visit over the last 3 years, and gave a number of very specific programs as examples for how those can operate. So if you haven't had a chance to pull that down, it's on the Children's Bureau website. I'd encourage you just to take a look at that, because it goes to some fundamental issues. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good afternoon. This is a table question. Pulling everybody in on this.
I'll give a table answer.
Can you provide suggestions on how to change the mindset of the collective system, internal and external, in concert with those of our caregivers? Because we're talking about foster parents, right? But we also need to talk about how do we change that mindset overall as a whole.
Yeah, you couldn't be more right. I think it is that fundamental value there and the mindset that I believe very often prevents me from getting what I want in Washington, D.C., which is much more flexibility in our federal funding, so that we can be partners with these kinds of programs that I think are so effective out there. I know firsthand how much the values get in the way of moving in a different direction. I can tell you that for me, I don't know what it is going to take necessarily to change somebody else's mindset, but when I know a person, when I have met a person face to face, and I've tried to understand what their circumstances are, what difficulties that they've faced, my opinions, my thoughts, my values attached to that person are often very, very different than when I have heard of those people. And when I hear about behaviors that don't comport with what I think parents ought to be engaging in. We have to know people. And as I said at the beginning of these remarks, the voices of those parents and young people have reinforced for me 1,000 times over that what I believe about our child welfare system is the right thing, because their experiences reflect what we've done that was not the right thing so many times. So we have to elevate those voices. There are young people that spend time up on Capitol Hill every summer, so that legislators, staffers get a chance to know them, to understand what their experiences are. And let me assure you, I get legislative proposals to comment on a routine basis that reflect that kind of enlightenment or acknowledgement. We have to have, I think, formal systems out there to tap into those voices and to elevate those voices, so that people who have the responsibility and privilege of making decisions around funding, around policy, around practices, are doing that in a really informed way and not making broad, generalized opinions that may not be accurate about the people that we serve out there. That's not the only way, but I think until we get to know the people, until we understand the adversities that so many of them experience, I don't think that many of our fundamental values are really going to change.
Can I also add, in terms of what we can tangibly do in Connecticut, it's a little bit along the lines of what we were saying earlier. How we create or we recreate our narrative is vitally important. So we have to submit a 5-year child and family services plan. And in our CFSP, one of the first things that I did was I invited sister state agencies and other stakeholders to the table to say, this is not the DCF plan, this is the Connecticut plan. And how are we going to narrow our front door? And so the purpose for kind of tacking this onto Family First and having our Family First kickoff with external people first, that was intentional. It wasn't to make sure, it wasn't to keep us behind. It was to say, you gotta help buy into this and drive the value shift along with us. And those state agencies, DMV was at the table, housing was at the table, transportation was at the table, labor was at the table, OEC, Office of Early Childhood. All of those other state agencies first said, what can we do? And I said, what are we already doing together? Let's take inventory of the things that we're doing together, and then let's think about creatively and critically how we can move that forward. State police, superintendents of schools, the faith-based community, all of those people and those visits that I had in that slide in those first 6 months of the administration, those 345 visits was getting out there, telling our story and reframing who we are. We can define our values. We don't have to wait for somebody else to do that for us. And I think as a child welfare system along the way, we have allowed the external forces to define us as the leader. We've allowed the headlines to define us. And our kids are speaking loudly that we need to not only speak for them, but speak for us. Who are we? And so this is why it's important for us to be able to take this message and elevate it beyond this room.
I couldn't agree. Yeah, let's talk about that. I think the issue of stakeholder involvement that the commissioners highlighted here is absolutely essential. So often as a child welfare agency, we try to strike out and chart our own course there without bringing in the critical players, particularly courts in so many situations, who can either make or break the direction of the course that we've chosen. When I'm out there pounding the pavement, going from one program to another, the most successful ones that I'm seeing are those where the communities themselves are the ones carrying the message of how can we strengthen children and families. And when we participate in that and we allow that and facilitate that to happen, we're doing a lot of different things. We're not only taking a giant step to change mindsets and to create the conditions for families to thrive, we're creating allies among our stakeholder group out there who, when adversity does strike us as a system, are well positioned to be spokespersons,
right.
yes, spokespeople for what we need to do going forward. I was out in Nebraska not too long ago at a community-based program out there, and was surprised. I walked into a room about as full as this, not quite this large, of people from the community who had come together to say every one of us can contribute something to the well-being of children and families in our community. And we want to create that kind of a system before families, for any family in our neighborhood, our community, who needs it, before they get to such a point that a call to the child welfare hotline is necessary. It struck me that the person up there leading the charge for all of this was not the child welfare agency, it wasn't a judge, it was the county sheriff. How often do we get law enforcement that engaged and that passionate about saying we can do better by children and families? That doesn't naturally happen without some facilitation. And I think in all of your communities you have the opportunity to begin or continue or strengthen or whatever stage you may be at, that kind of community collaboration where there is a joint vision and a joint commitment to do right by kids and families.
Good afternoon. My questions have both federal and state level implications. For example, how do we stop penalizing people with housing when they're not perfect? And we know some of them are going to have criminal records or evictions, and part of that is related to institutional racism. How do we get the private sector to buy into opening grocery stores in our communities so that people have ready access to quality food and not just what's available at the bodega on the corner. How do we get employers to employ people who are not perfect?
Wow. You've identified some of the incredibly destructive symptoms of a system out there. I'm not talking about a child welfare system. I'm talking about a society that's often very judgmental and very exclusionary, and that would often rather pay the price for that exclusivity and isolation than really trying to work hard to prevent that. I think some of the examples that I've given where communities come together to understand what the needs are, what the problems are, is certainly a beginning point for that. Because if it doesn't happen at the community level, it's not going to happen for children and families. Those words are not going to be any different. I can work all day at the federal government to try to bring people together around a common vision. It has to materialize where children and where parents live. And I think by working in communities, bringing in the different sectors that you just mentioned, the business sector, the parks and recreation people, the chambers of commerce, the educational systems, there are examples out there where those partners are coming together, united around a common theme and how we can support that theme in the lives of children and families in our community. I think that's a beginning point for it. I don't want to let myself off the hook, though, because I think that at a policy level and a very high level, we have to do far better at the federal government around bringing those partners together so that we start to eliminate some of the barriers that we can eliminate to the kind of system that you just described out there that's much more hospitable to our children and families. We are doing that at the federal level. We're not nearly where I want us to be, but Jeremy and I were planning on the train ride up here today, another meeting among our federal agencies that will be happening in Washington, D.C. on Monday. Around how do we begin as a Medicaid system, as a HUD system, as an education system, as a Medicaid system, as a SAMHSA, whatever that stands for, system. How do we begin to break down many of those barriers so that children and families have a different system? Yes, correct. I'll do that tomorrow.
Good afternoon. So mine is more of a comment, and it's consistent with what the commissioner was saying, and I, of course, had the opportunity to have Vannessa directly as my boss for years. So she knows our catchment area in particular. So in Danbury, we have a lot of undocumented families, and so there's tons of issues that we talk about often just related to those families. But I think, to me, having sat at a table earlier with Chris Lau, where you think about the evolution of DCF, I think it's just more what I would consider now, it's just like where preparation meets opportunity. So I just think we have to keep pushing people to change. I think, and I use your analogy often about the slinky. I think sometimes we start with trying to get all the masses to agree with us, and then we have fighting. I think sometimes if you have those early adopters, and then the rest of it comes over because it becomes so heavy, that I think people just want the change. So I think for us, what I notice in my community, people are afraid. And if I think about DCF's evolution, we often were focused on being afraid. Like, what if we didn't do this? Someone was going to judge us. So oftentimes when we reach out to our community partners, we say to them, well, like, why did you not ask the family this first before you called us? And then usually it's that fear-based, response. So I think if we can continue to coach them, educate them, continue to walk with them through, not that we're saying don't do what you need to do,
no, exactly.
but how to access, how to help a family.
Sure.
And then we had a gentleman, much like you said, that we were outposting staff now. Now we're trying to actually get more staff with them. So we had this captain in New Milford who actually said, I'm one of these people who likes to get out in front of things. So anything you want to try, let me know, we'll do it.
Good. So
we signed a memorandum of agreement, so we have someone now working out there. But it's like your drug enforcement officers. We have people, resource officers within schools in that community. It's a town that we have a lot of activity in. So I think it is the poverty. I think it's a lot of those things that if we can help people take small steps, maybe they'll gain their confidence and then they'll be more willing to join kind of the conversation we're having today about values.
Right.
So.
Jerry, can you please, because we had a conversation about this privately, you mentioned it from there, and then Kelly just mentioned it again. Can you talk about the dangers of fear-based practice?
Well, I probably don't need to with this group of people, but you know, we recoil very often when something bad happens. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. We go back to what's safe, to what's comfortable, to what will protect us many times, without always having what it takes to stick to a practice that we firmly believe in. And I think that's a real disservice to children and families. I think that when we do that, you know what happens. Numbers in foster care start spiking. And when numbers in foster care start spiking, you start having more kids that have more traumatic experiences. And when that happens, we've got all kinds of consequences that come. Higher levels of care that are required, more expensive kinds of services that are required, and increased risk that we just foster an intergenerational pattern that's not serving children and families or us well. I think we have to be very clear on what it is that we're doing, on what our practice is. We have to be very clear on why we believe that's the right thing to do. And even when things don't go the way we planned in every situation, we have to have the fortitude to stick with that practice so that we can do right by children and families. We serve no one when we just recoil into something that seems much safer for us. And I would say that as somebody who carried a caseload myself and operated in a fair amount of fear, because frankly I didn't know what I was doing, and I was afraid that I would make bad decisions or the wrong decisions. When we recoil into that, I don't think we alleviate that fear from staff. In many respects, I think it just reinforces for them the whole fear component of the work. If they see that the agency is willing to back off on its practice because something unfortunate has happened, we don't instill the confidence that workers need to have to go out and work effectively with children and families.
Excellent. I think we have one more, and then we're going to move on with our program. Right. So if you didn't get your question answered, and you have one, or you're thinking of one, you have the opportunity to answer it, ask it a little later. And please, can somebody? I hear Michael Williams' voice. It's getting cold in here. Y'all, didn't it just get cold in here? Did y'all feel like somebody fix the heat? Turn up the heat. Can we have the last? Turn off the AC, yes, thank you. Probably somebody complained that it was hot, and so they turned it on, and that's probably what happened. Okay, this has been fabulous, hasn't it so far? Fabulous, thank you. Brian?
Hi, I know with the workplace, being afraid that something's going to come back to bite us when we make a decision is part of our work culture. I think another part of our daily experience is there are some things that we realize we really can't fix. And that just as our families feel powerless in many ways, in our roles we sometimes feel powerless. Actually, every week we feel powerless. One of those things has to do with folks who really don't have stable housing. And certainly people from outside DCF turn to us and ask us, well, can't you do such and such for housing? So my question though for you is, from a nationwide perspective with the child welfare systems in the different states, any good news about working with our other partners to help folks with housing a little more effectively than certainly we experience in Connecticut?
Well, I'm going to say that I see it as an incredibly big problem. Having recently reread the book Evicted, if a lot of people read the book Evicted, well, you need to read it. I need to probably read it a third time. It's one of the most poignant accountings of what happens to families when they get in that cycle of housing instability and inability to provide a safe living environment for their children, and the intersection of that with child welfare. That's a digression, but I think that is one of the biggest culprits in the lives of the difficulties that our families face. I don't see it as huge as the problem is as insurmountable. There are examples that I'm still trying to learn from where the Child Welfare Agency and other agencies have come together with the housing agencies, mostly at a county level, to try and create that sort of a system out there that addresses that need. Boulder County, Colorado is one of those counties that has done a tremendous amount of work, and we are trying to learn from them and get our own version of technical assistance so that we can understand better how to help other jurisdictions do that. San Diego County is another county that's been able to address that at a certain level, even though the problems with homelessness there are still huge. The point of that is that there are concrete examples there. It takes a tremendous amount of work. It helps, obviously, when the housing authority is somehow integrated into the broader human service agency structure, but I don't think it's always absolutely necessary for that to happen. We have to find ways where we can connect, where we can intersect with those so that we can begin to address that fundamental issue. So there is some good news there, but it's still one of the most common problems that I hear about when I'm traveling around.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move into the... You remember what I said in the beginning, that he was passionate, provocative, all that, and he's one of us. I feel like we're in good hands. I hope you all understand that we're in good hands at the federal level. And you got a little sneak peek of that. And I'm not just saying that because he's here. It's because I know who he is as an individual. I know what he says behind closed doors, and I know what he's doing. So give him another round of applause. He is going to stay. Jeremy is over there, and so that you will be able to ask questions throughout. I think. Is that open? Okay. All right. Next up, we are really. As I said, 31 years I've been in this field, and we have the opportunity to partner not only with the federal government but with Casey Family Programs. And Susan Reilly has been a staple here in Connecticut DCF. And she's going to come to you today to really just talk about the opportunities of Family First Prevention Act for children and families, and the work that she's been doing or hearing and leading around the country as well in her role as at Casey. So please, she's no stranger to you all. And I think we're going to take a break right after Susan does her opening. Does her presentation. So please help me, join me in welcoming Susan Reilly to the And now I want everybody to pretend they're surprised I'm here. I want a cheering welcome, right? Thank you for that, Jodi, though. I do appreciate that. I really am not going to introduce myself. I feel like I know just about everybody in the room. But if not, I am Susan Reilly, and I am with Casey Family Programs, which is the nation's largest operating foundation focused on safely reducing the need for foster care and building communities of hope. There we go. Thank you so much. We're all expected to do our tagline with excellence there. So I actually want to dig in a little under more about what Jerry was talking about, and actually some of the questions, particularly the table talk question over there about values. And before I talk about Family First specifically, I want to dig into that a little bit more. So a paradigm shift is something that I suggest we need. And I think that that's what you heard from Dr. Milner, because a paradigm is a theory, a group of ideas about how we think, how we form our reactions to things and solve puzzles, is based in the paradigm in which we live, right?
So in suggesting this idea for a need for a shift, I think we need, and I will keep it very brief, but a very brief history lesson. Okay, to how did we get to the questions that we've been asking and the challenge that Dr. Milner has posed for us? So just want to go back a little bit, back to colonial times, right? In the 19th and 20th century. Society's response to families who could not care for their children was largely based on the English poor laws. The notion of the deserving and the undeserving poor. And the responses to families with children, and that those families were poor or homeless or jobless, those families we're still talking about, was to rescue them. We're going to intervene, we're going to separate them from their families so that they wouldn't end up like their parents. Working with the poor was grounded in social Darwinism, based on the survival of the fittest, right? You had to be able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, that there was moral superiority in rising above this. It was thought that the deviant family was the cause of the problem. Therefore, again, children needed to be saved or rescued from their poor parents, especially those whose race or ethnicity differed from the majority culture. So African American families, Native American families, immigrant families. Is this sounding familiar? So this idea of the worthy, the unworthy poor ideology created a tension between the values of rescuing children and supporting families. At one end of the continuum was the unworthy poor, who were saved by separation and were indentured, placed in orphanages. Everybody remember the story of and it's not a story, the true facts around the orphan trains? At the other end was the idea that environmental influences and societal beliefs and biases can contribute to social and individual problems. So the 19th century belief system strongly held the belief that the individuals were responsible for their conditions. And so our child welfare system was built. The fundamental pillar of child protection in the United States is based on the child rescue orientation and mentality. Another major tension involved the role of government. So in the early years, who was involved in societal issues? Early child welfare. Here in Connecticut, what is now the Village for Families and Children is if not one of the longest continuously operating organizations. And it didn't start by being funded by government, right? It was local philanthropy that did that. So again, we had a tension between the role of philanthropy and community and the role of government, both on the local and state level. Anybody still feel that? What's your role in getting into families' lives? If you do it, you're wrong. And if you don't do it, and something goes wrong, then you're wrong. So we're still dealing with this tension. There we go. So once again, just to sort of recap this idea of where we are, which Jerry talked about. What do we do now? Our system is built on this idea of the left-hand side, the individual responsibility. When do we intervene? After maltreatment. So we are called in order to investigate. It's based on the individual. It's problem and deficit oriented, has been the history of our child welfare system. Whereas on the other side, of course if I looked at my slides here and didn't have to turn around, wouldn't that make it easy? The idea of the environmental conditions. That if we could, as Jerry was referencing, move upstream, if we could begin to intervene before maltreatment occurs, to intervene at a population level, to look at who's at risk, which could be all of us on any given day. The universal and population level interventions, these things are pretty diametrically opposed, and that's that paradigm shift. Those tensions are playing out, and we're beginning to develop some of the tools that might lead us in another direction. As also Dr. Milner talked about, going back and forth between Jerry and Dr. Milner here, I'll stick with Jerry there. Again, traditionally, outcomes have not been good for those youth who's either spent long times of period in foster care or even worse, aged out of care. And I think you're all familiar with the data, and that's again, one of these places we don't want to continue to have to be the narrative of child welfare. And so, see how quickly and neatly I summed up the history of child welfare? I think I did that in under 5 minutes. That brings us to the Family First Prevention and Services Act. I cannot underscore enough what Jerry said, which is this is a tool. This is not a solution. It's a step in the right direction towards this paradigm shift. And most importantly, to have that really make sense is this. You have to start with your vision and your goals. If you start with the dollars and the cents and what is the federal government telling us we have to do now, get on our checklists, make sure that we're meeting the requirements, it will be a dismal failure. You really have to start with the Commissioner's 5 Ps. And the vision that she is setting out to say that's what's important and what are the tools that we have to make that vision come alive. And you are very lucky this is going to be a short and high level because we want to hear what's going on here in Connecticut, and I know you want to have the cookies that I brought in for you. Because I will tell you on Monday in another jurisdiction with whom I work, their legislative committee, their version of the Children's Committee, they're thinking about family first, and they're thinking about fiscal implications. So they have requested an independent fiscal analysis from their independent fiscal office, OMB type thing, on the implications of family first. So there I was on the phone with them for an hour, these fiscal folks who know nothing about this, trying to explain this legislation as clearly as I could, along with one of my policy partners. And they were mighty confused by the end of the hour. So there will be more conversations. I am not going to do that to you. We're going to keep it high level. Okay. So this legislation is bipartisan. It was in the making for numerous years. And some of us can say kind of passed by surprise at the time that it did. But back in February 2008 as a bipartisan, part of the Bipartisan Budget Act. This really was, as I said, a culmination of years of talking and discussing and the support of lots of organizations and input from those organizations in crafting something that could begin to move us in another direction. And there really are some big opportunities for child welfare. So pre-2018, so the child welfare system that we've all been working under, contained the things on the left. As Jerry mentioned, the vast majority of federal funding goes to support out-of-home care, right? Children in foster care. The services were only to the child. We weren't talking about supporting services to the child and their family, but only to the child. That famous income test to qualify, which can often get tied up in the, how reasonable do we want our efforts to be? Or how much are we going to focus on that? There was no funding of dedicated kinship navigator programs, and no dollars for a child to be placed with their parent in a residential treatment. Again, everything was focused on the child and primarily on a child in out-of-home care. If you look at the other side, some of the opportunities that come under Family First, there is for the first time, this is an open-ended entitlement, federal dollars for prevention. These prevention dollars are for the parent and the child together. There is no income test. We'll talk a little bit about candidacy as we go on and how these folks get defined, but it's not defined by meeting this ancient AFDC income test. There will be new 50% reimbursement for kinship navigators programs that are evidence-based and are accepted on the federal clearinghouse. And there's 12 months of federal funding for placements and for evidence-based services. We will talk a little bit. That's just the real highlight of some, not all, of what's in this large legislation. I think the biggest message here is that Family First fundamentally shifts federal funding incentives toward prevention services. Okay, so these are family-centered policies that are going to help pave the way and allow the children to be served safely in their homes. That is the goal. Now, I'm a child welfare person. I have spent more decades than I'd like to know working in child welfare. So I always appreciate it when I get to spend time with my public policy partners at Casey, because they know child welfare, but what they really know is the policy side. So where'd Jeremy go as a policy person? So I always really appreciate some of the things that they share with me, and when I make legislative visits and have them with me to talk about what's important to legislators. And one of the things that they often talk about and remind me of, and they spend a lot of time on the Hill, is the intent of the legislation. So we can dive into the nuts and the bolts and how do you check the box and the complicated work that Cindy and Olga and that team is going to have to do here in Connecticut to make all that work. But for me, it's the intent of the legislation, which is this, that we need to start thinking about how we can support the vision of having children stay safely at home with their parents whenever possible. So the earliest date at which any jurisdiction could opt in, as we say, and implement Family First was October 1st of 2019. At this point in time, I'll give you a little update later on about where states are nationally in moving towards this. So these are the children and families in Connecticut who may be eligible for prevention services. So this is a child who's living with their parent, and parent I'm defining as parent caregiver, so that could be their biological parent, it could be an adoptive parent, it could be a kin caregiver, who's at risk of imminent placement in foster care, but could remain safely at home if they were to receive prevention services. A child who exited foster care to adoption, legal guardianship, reunification, and is at risk of re-entering can also get services along with their parents or caregivers. A child in kinship placement with relative caregivers, whether that's a guardian or not. And these children and their families, or children and their parents, got to be clear here on the actual definitions, can get episodes of care for up to 12 months funded. If they meet all the qualifications, and we'll talk more about what these services actually are. But for me, I was very excited when I heard this piece. Many evidence-based services are short-term in nature, 60 days, 90 days. But there may be needs that a family has to keep their children safely at home, and perhaps that is over a course of 6 months, and they stabilize, and then a year later, they're struggling again. This is an open-ended entitlement, so it does not mean that you got one shot at it. You could use the full 12 months, you could use part of those 12 months, you could have as many episodes as needed, and yes, there's assessments that need to go with that and individual prevention plans that need to be documented, but the opportunity is fairly open-ended to meet the needs of the children and families if they are at imminent risk of placement in foster care. Okay, so these prevention services, which is not the entirety, but it's a large piece of what this legislation is driving towards, are in 3 categories: mental health, substance abuse, and in-home parenting skills programs. I do want to note, because again, I'm just sharing my learnings. When I first saw in-home parenting skills, I'm like, what does that mean? What it means is that the child is living in their home, and the parent needs some services that are related to increasing their ability to safely parent their child. So it doesn't exclusively mean services in which a clinician goes into the home, and they can be group-based, community service-based, in the home, but the emphasis is on the child is still in the home with that caregiver who is receiving the services. Again, not more than 12 months at a time, but there can be sequential segments. Candidates are children in foster care who are pregnant or parenting. are immediately eligible for prevention services categorically. These services must be trauma-informed, and they have to be provided in accordance with being promising, supported, or well-supported as evidence-based practices. Just quick show of hands, probably shouldn't look over at the Solnit table. How many folks are familiar with evidence-based practices? Okay, didn't think I needed to ask. And evidence-based practices are typically graded, scaled, whatever the word is we want to use, put into categories about how strongly we believe that they will be effective in working with kids and families. Now again, when we get back to the intent of the law, why evidence-based services? Are those the only things that help families? No. We know there's lots of ways that families need support. But one way is through evidence-based services. And my folks who sit on the Hill and listen to the discussions of Congress, folks in Congress were quite clear. Why is it that we are spending federal dollars on things that don't work? And so if we can find some things that do work, and we have evidence that we work, that's where we want to put our money. The same with congregate care. That's another, reducing the use of congregate care is another piece of this legislation. Is that because congregate care at all times is inherently bad? No. We talked about that before. There are certain children who, for treatment needs, Michael talked about that earlier, should very appropriately have their treatment needs met. But it's not a placement solution. It's a treatment solution. So therefore, the emphasis in this act will support clinical treatment interventions at a congregate care level and not placement needs. Not to go into this too much, this is a group that's very familiar with this. Sometimes I'm talking to legislators or other groups that aren't as familiar with this. But the idea of promising, supported, and well-supported. How many folks are familiar with the California Clearinghouse? That's probably one of the most well-known of the, I don't know what you call it, it's a clearinghouse, repository, place that makes decisions about how evidence-based practices fit into these categories, does the research on them, tracks the studies, and puts them in one of these categories. The federal government, in all their wisdom, has developed their own federal clearinghouse to make sure that the programs that they are willing to fund and support are ones that are going to get us the best outcomes possible for the children and families who come to our attention through the child welfare system. Which way am I going here? So again, you're probably familiar with these. These are the kinds of things that make a program, deem a program to be evidence-based. Things like they have to have a book or a manual. You can't say, we're doing a really great job with families over here, they're getting really good results, they really like the service, you ought to do this too. Well, how do we do it? Well, you know, you kind of do this, that, and the other, and we have some of our folks could talk to your folks. That's not going to rise to the level of something that could be studied and researched. There has to be a clear model of what this is, along with the research and the evaluation to back it up. So, the Family First Clearinghouse for Evidence-Based Practices is underway. There are not lots and lots of programs on it yet, but there is a process through which the programs are being studied, reevaluated, and the decision is being made by the folks for this clearinghouse where they fall on the Family First Federal Clearinghouse. So this is a little tricky because I tried to get it all on one slide and use color coding and not make it too crazy. But here are the three categories: mental health, substance abuse, and in-home skill-based parenting. And remember, I also mentioned kinship navigator programs is another area. Those that show up in the green are well supported, in the blue are supported, in the yellow are promising, and the purple ones are deemed as not even meeting the criteria to be rated on the clearinghouse. So for instance, you'll see MST, multisystemic therapy, is in green, as well supported. MST, child abuse, didn't even meet the criteria on the federal clearinghouse. So it's a different rating system and way of looking at things than some ways you may have seen these programs evaluated through other clearinghouses or other rating systems. but this is what the feds are working with, and these are the programs that jurisdictions are going to have the opportunity to select from right into their 5-year plan, work with their federal partners to agree on the plan, and these services will be part of that plan. But as I said, there's some good news. This is what's up next, currently being reviewed on the clearinghouse. So you again see mental health, pretty good group there, substance abuse, in-home parenting skills, and kinship navigator programs. So as I said, the first 2 kinship navigator programs that got reviewed didn't meet criteria to be rated, but there's 2 other ones that are under review at this point. The feds have also set up an opportunity for jurisdictions to use their own internal process, use their own evaluating team, contract with a university or some other sort of evaluation team to follow a similar process that the folks at the Federal Clearinghouse are using, and be able to do some of that work sort of on behalf of the feds, and then present that and say, we did the work, here's how we came up with what our recommendation is and when this falls. So hopefully that too will also add to the speed to which programs get added to the clearinghouse. So this is the piece moving away from the evidence-based practices that has to do with appropriate placements in foster care. So that gives you a little bit, again, this is what the federal government is now saying they're going to support. So it is no longer just out-of-home placement. We have a foster family home, and that is defined. There are foster family model licensing standards that were part of the legislation that all the jurisdictions are looking at, and there were maybe no more than 6 children in foster care, with some exceptions, sibling groups and some of those kinds of things. Facilities for pregnant and parenting youth, supervised independent living for youth 18 and older, specialized placements for youth who are at risk or are being sex trafficked is another population that's been identified under the legislation as automatically eligible for services, and family-based residential treatment facilities for substance abuse. I'm not sure, do we have any of those in Connecticut, treatment facilities where a child and a parent? Good. So those will now, if they are trauma-informed, evidence-based, if the quality of the program is going to meet the standard, once Connecticut opts in, would be eligible for reimbursement.
Those programs are for very young children.
Okay.
And it's the mom only.
Mom only. Okay. So there's a long way to go. There's lots of opportunity. Where are the dads? It's always where are the dads? But it's a start. Okay, so you've got a leg up.
So there's nothing for LGBT population?
Not specifically. No. 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 Yep, they're not called out specifically as a population. However, as I said, this is a first start, and I think that's an example. There are numerous at-risk populations that need specific attention and resources, and so the conversation is not done, but this is where we're starting. Then you get to see there in the large red letters, qualified residential treatment programs. So this is another area that if you've been following Family First at all, that there's been kind of a lot of chatter, made a lot of jurisdictions, made a lot of providers rather nervous. Because the QRTP, as it's called, the Qualified Residential Treatment Program, is one of the areas that federal funding can be used for, but it's not your average group home. It's not even your average treatment program. It's a program that has to meet the federal specifications that are laid out in the legislation. So that includes things, they must be trauma-informed, it must be evidence-based, you must have access to 24-hour nursing. Not that all the nursing has to be on-site, but access to 24-hour nursing, qualified clinicians, many of these things that are built in. So in Connecticut, you will probably may very well have some of those. In some jurisdictions, that feels like a high bar to set. So that's why there's been some controversy, or not controversy, consternation perhaps is a better word, around the country as people think, what's it going to take for us to implement all these different areas? There are a couple of other items. As I said, we've already mentioned kinship navigator programs, which again, you don't have here in Connecticut, but it's an opportunity. Again, it'll have to be evidence-based. It'll have to make its way onto the clearinghouse, but it too would be eligible for a 50% reimbursement with these new federal dollars. Again, with the earliest start date being October 1st. I've already mentioned the foster parent licensing standards. Now that does not mean that any jurisdiction, it does not mean that here in Connecticut, you have to look at what the feds put forth as model licensing standards and do absolutely everything that they said. I've actually been quite happy with some of the conversation back and forth between federal partners and jurisdictions about how to implement this and how things can go into plans. So for example, in another jurisdiction I was on the committee that looked at their licensing standards and literally lined them up. Okay, here's the model licensing standards. Here's what we currently do in this jurisdiction. These match, these match, these match. What are the ones that don't match? And we literally walked through and said, yeah, that's a great idea. We didn't have that in our policy or our regulation, or do we need a statutory change? We agree with this, or we don't agree with this. It was actually very interesting, and it's why I always recommend, and you are doing here in Connecticut, is having diverse stakeholders around the table where you have these discussions. I don't think I'm talking out of school. The jurisdiction I was working with is Pennsylvania, and it was absolutely fascinating because things I wouldn't have said, I would have said, sure, great idea. So one of the model licensing standards had something around have to have a working telephone in the home. I was like, well, yeah, of course. And a provider from a specific area in Pennsylvania said, well, what about our Amish and Mennonite communities? It's like, oh, that's right, we're in Pennsylvania. Not that Pennsylvania is the exclusive, but that's the jurisdiction we happen to be in. So what does that mean here in this jurisdiction? And you have the opportunity to go back to your federal partners and say, this is why we do not believe that we're going to change our policy specifically around this because it wouldn't meet the needs of our communities. So, opportunity to talk with your federal partners around all this. See how quickly I can go through this? I'm not giving you the deep and dirty. There's also some court-related provisions built into the Act. So there's court oversight of group placements. So if you're going to place in, let's say, a QRTP, there has to be an assessment by a qualified clinician, and there has to be agreement by the courts also that this is the correct placement, and that needs to be revisited with ongoing assessments and ongoing approval of the courts. It did also require the courts to participate in the statewide plans to prevent child abuse and neglect fatalities. So each state is supposed to be writing, not supposed to, will be, if they haven't, creating a plan to eliminate and decrease child abuse, neglect, and fatalities. And the courts should be part of that. They have a role. CIP funds were included in this, particularly around training court personnel, and the electronic data exchange to expedite interstate placements. So those are not the things that you always hear about. You know, mostly we hear about the evidence-based practices and some of the oversight of congregate care placements. But some of these other things are built into this rather large federal legislation. Now, how many people are kind of going like, wait, can I do the hair going back? Feeling a little bit overwhelmed when you start hearing, yeah, I've heard that family first thing bounced around. Now it's starting to sound a little confusing and in-depth. Again, there's some very good news that I have to share around that. And one is that our federal partners, both within Jerry's shop at the Children's Bureau, but also on Capitol Hill, are listening. And they're realizing that there are some things that need to be done, ways to speed up programs to be evaluated and get on the clearinghouse. And equally, if not more important, was the fact that it's going to take a lot to implement this. Now that can be evidenced by the fact that out of our 50 states plus DC, who's implemented this? Now coming out of the gate, passed in February, first time ability to implement was this October. There were 17 states that stepped up and said, we want to be first. we have every intention we want to implement on October 1st, 2019. Unless it's changed, 2? Yeah, there are 2. I think there's been 7 or 8 plans that have been submitted to the feds for approval, back and forth, kind of like your PIP. You know, there's some back and forth on writing a plan and making sure that you're working with your federal partners and doing them. So far, 2 of those have been approved. So there's a lot of work in figuring out how you want to do this, what this means, how you're going to define things like candidacy, and we don't mean candidacy for receiving $40 under old foster care. This is candidacy for family first prevention services, those mental health, substance abuse, and in-home parenting skills. Connecticut gets to make that decision. The federal government is not going to say, we're going to tell you who in Connecticut you think can best benefit and you have the resources and the system to do that. That's up to Connecticut to define, and you're going to hear from Joshonda and Ken a little bit more about that. So that work is starting here in Connecticut and in other jurisdictions to make those decisions. How are we going to define that population? But it is a fair amount of work, and so far we only have 2 states with approved plans. It is Connecticut's deep intention, and people are working along like crazy, to submit a plan within this year and hopefully implement on October 1st of 2020. But the other great support that came from the federal government was realizing how complicated this is and that some of the high bars that are set, so for instance, one of the high bars is once you look at what's on the Federal Clearinghouse and say out of the, let's say 20 programs that are on there, here are the 3 that we in Connecticut, or the 4 that here in Connecticut, that we want to put on our plan, be able to use with our families who meet our definition of candidacy, and draw down federal reimbursement at 50%. 50% of those programs would have to fall in the well-supported category. So the bar gets a little higher, right? So, because there weren't that many things that were well-supported. But again, our congressional partners have recognized this challenge, and on, I think it was December 23rd, I believe, that was a Monday, they passed the Family First Transition Act. So recognition that there was going to need some more support in order to actually move this legislation forward. So this includes a phase-in of that 50% well-supported requirement for prevention services. So it'll be over the course of a few years that you'll have to meet that level of having 50% of your evidence-based practices in that well-supported category. So that's going to give jurisdictions time to see what goes up on the clearinghouse, get programs implemented. How many folks have been part of implementing an evidence-based practice? You're overseeing the contract, you've worked in an agency, you're at a facility. It's challenging, right, to get all those requirements in place. So this is going to give some time to move up to that. There's also a recognition that it takes some funding to do this also. So there's transition funding to help states implement Family First. These are not funds that you have to apply for. They are going to come to you from the federal government. It's not huge buckets of money, and there's a set aside for those tribal nations that pull down 4E funds directly. But still, there's a piece that's saying we recognize that a little more help in doing this, and we at the federal government are willing to provide some funding to help states to implement this. The other piece, which is not going to be applied here in Connecticut, but just so you know, they were being thoughtful around this. Out of those states that have been operating under a Title 4E demonstration project, a Title 4E waiver, that's another group that was kind of nervous. We've been operating under a waiver. We now need to move to this Family First way of doing business. There's kind of a gap in between. What are we going to do? So for those states, there's also some funding to make sure that that transition from operating under a waiver to operating under Family First can be as smooth as possible. So yeah, skip my slides and just get talking. There it is. It was December 20th. The phase has been well supported. I already shared this around the nation. 17 states had planned, 7 prevention plans submitted, 2 prevention plans approved. At Casey, this has become a major piece of work. Well, it has been a major piece of work for us for the last few years. Really partnering with jurisdictions across the country as well as with our federal partners to figure out how can we best support the opportunities in this federal legislation. So for those of you who've been part of Casey convenings, we love to bring people together, to talk, to share, to learn. So back last June, we brought together those 17 states who raised their hands first and said, we want to go first. And we brought them together to talk, like, what are you thinking? Why do you want to do this? What are your ideas? What can you learn from each other? That led to what has been an ongoing series of webinars and phone conferences. Every other week, we were convening those 17 states by phone and VTC to, again, talk about what are you doing? What are you writing into your plans? What questions have you asked the feds? What answers did you get? And they were finding them to be so effective, and people were appreciating the conversation so much that with my very skillful colleagues who run these, they're pretty well scripted because you've got a lot of people who are listening in. So most people are listening and others are presenting or providing information about what they're doing. But we've opened it up to all 50 states. So Connecticut was invited to join those calls as of October. And so you're having the benefit of that ongoing learning along with whatever other kinds of resources I can bring to you. It's on your handouts, I think, but I really urge you to go to the FamilyFirstAct.org website. So that is a website. We are one of the organizations that is supporting it, but we're really using that as a place to say, along with our partners at Foster Club, who are sort of the main curators of this, everything that we can find related to Family First. You want to know what the APA says about Family First? You can go here and find it. The ABA, you can go here and find it. Want to read Utah's prevention plan? You can go there and find it. And for those who are part of that learning collaborative, we have an extra site for them. So there are some folks here in Connecticut who can access even more information. So back to where I started. Can you begin to see how this kind of thinking and this kind of action from the feds is supporting that paradigm shift? We're not way upstream yet, but we're moving upstream with the support of our federal partners. And then we're going to be hearing more from our Connecticut team. So thank you.
So to understand where Family First fits into everything, you have to think about one of the things I heard, and that was kind of the value shift. And so the good news is that that value shift around reduction of children in congregate settings, we've already started down that road. The increase in children with relatives, we've already started down that road. The appreciation for the behavioral health needs of children related to services you can measure, we've already started down that road. The piece that makes it a little bit more complicated is the reimbursement structure for prevention services. And so what you're going to hear in a couple of minutes is some of the framework that Connecticut has put in place, or starting to put in place, to develop what our plan will look like. Family First will not be, so if you think of a pie, Family First is not going to be all of what we do. The values and the vision around how we can shift a child welfare system will be the underpinnings of Family First, and that's a fraction of who we will be as a larger child welfare system. So that's why we use the majority of the day to set the framework from a values base. The reimbursement structure gets a little bit more complicated, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in the coming months, but don't concern yourself with that big picture, because that's where it gets confusing about what this means for our entire service array. It doesn't mean that tomorrow or even next year things are going to change fundamentally from a practice standpoint, because we've already started to till the ground and do some of the hard work necessary to move our system to start thinking about things from a much different way than we already have. It's this prevention value system that will finally now catch up with the direction that we're going.
As the commissioner indicated, Ken and I are going to be stepping through
the steps of what we are doing in Connecticut to implement much of what you've heard from the previous speakers. I recognize some of you all in the room may be saying, who in the world is that? My name is Joshonda Guerrier. I currently work in the Clinical Community Supervision Support Services Division, which I tell them all the time, we gotta change that name. But if you guys knew who was Christina Stevens previously, I have the pleasure of fulfilling that role for the Department of Children and Families in the state of Connecticut currently. So thank you all for giving us the opportunity to walk through Connecticut's plan this afternoon. One of two co-leads, as you were here, that is responsible for leading this effort. Mr. Ken Mysogland, who you will hear from shortly, is the other co-lead for the state of Connecticut. And as was stated earlier, we have been doing a lot of work since that external kickoff that the commissioner mentioned that was intentional back in November. That was November 18 of 2019. We had that meeting, and so this room was packed. We actually had half this space, and everybody wanted to know what was going on in Connecticut with regards to Family First. So that was our launch. We gave them the opportunity to sign up to be a part of this process. Our timeline, Susan Reilly kind of alluded to it when she said it is our intent. She knows that we are tenacious and we are going to take it beyond intent, that we have to get there because we have committed to trying to implement Families First in 2020 of this year. And so what that does is that does put us on a relatively aggressive timeline to be able to get this work done. But we have been working feverishly over the last 2 months, meeting all of our 5 work groups, which I will walk you through what those 5 work groups are. In a moment, all of those 5 work groups have met at least once since that kickoff. Some of you have been voluntold to join. Others, after today's presentation, may express an interest in wanting to join. Those conversations can happen with your leadership if this is something that you really want to be at the table around, because it does impact us all. And you guys have heard us say that it takes many, not just internal to the department, but external to the department as well. So we will continue to have meetings. They vary in length. One of our groups have been meeting weekly. Most of our groups are going to be meeting every other week. We have one group that's meeting half a day once a month. So just a lot of work effort is going into getting this work done. And we're going to continue those meetings to the end of March. Maybe it may bleed into April if the work dictates that we need to. But ideally, we'd really like to take the recommendations from all of the work groups and roll them up to our governance committee to begin to draft our plan in April. And so the reason why we need to draft the plan in April is because, as you can imagine, there'll be a little bit of back and forth. We would then need to step into governor approval in May. Once we have that approval, ideally we'd like to submit our version of Connecticut's plan for Family First in June. Why June for the October implementation? Because rarely do states get their plans approved without some back and forth with the feds. So we need the summer to be able to respond to their questions, their tweaks, their modifications, so that we will be ready to go October of this year. So that is the dream, that is the goal, that is the eye on the prize, and so we're going to stay focused and committed to hopefully get to our anticipated goal date. So of those 5 groups, we have one for candidacy, one for programs and service array, one for kinship and foster care, one for fiscal and revenue enhancement, and our last was our community partnerships and family and child engagement groups. I'm going to step you through each of those work groups very quickly to kind of give you a high level of what that means. Our candidacy group is actually chaired by myself and Dr. Jeff Vanderploeg. What you all will find when you look at the structure of our co-chairs, that we have an internal and an external representative for each of them. Again, we're very important to us to have buy-in from the external community, so therefore we have an external partner as a chair so that they are helping to drive the decision-making around the investigation, around the recommendations that will be put forth. The goal of the candidacy group is much of which you've heard Susan talk about in terms of what is a candidate for Families First. So a candidate for Families First, we have actually a 2-step goal in this particular work group. There's a very small, narrow subset of candidates. Susan talked to you and exposed you to evidence-based. She talked to you about imminent risk for removal. She talked about services being on the clearinghouse if you don't take anything else from that, take that it is going to be a bit of a challenge to be able to include everybody that you would want to include when you think about a prevention plan. So that very narrow what we can actually receive federal reimbursement for, that's one definition that the group has to focus on. You've heard folks talk to you about Family First being a tool. So that tool is a source of funds to support a very specific population. So we as a state have to define what populations, what groups of youth, caregivers, we want to be able to tap into those funds based on the eligible services that we put in place in our plan. But our commissioner's direction and vision has also said we want to be bigger than what Family First allows. So she has really challenged us and tasked us to look beyond the narrow and get more upstream in terms of the broad, which is why we have partners at the table. All of those folks that you heard her reference earlier that was engaged in the CFSP process, acronyms, Child and Services Plan. All of those folks that they had at the table in the summer, those folks have also been invited to be at the table for this because it's just a natural intersection and progression to be able to really have them committed to that larger vision that we need as a state so that we get beyond what we've always done in the past. We get beyond that very small Family First tool and we look collectively across systems to figure out how to serve families at home sooner, no matter which door of the system that they come to. So that's a two-step process that this particular work group is going to be working on. Programs and services array, they have been working. That group is led by Dr. Elizabeth Canada, as well as our internal Elizabeth Guerrier. She's our systems director. Those two are starting to guide their group in a manner that allows them to start looking at what Connecticut's service array currently is. You guys have the benefit of a strong continuum so far. I know you've done a lot of work with regards to evidence-based practices, but now is our time to really look at, of those services, which ones map to the candidate population that the candidacy group is going to define as our families and our children that we serve in our system. We have to have a real critical look, if you will, about value add, about quality, and then looking in terms of a gap analysis of what's missing. While we have a lot, is a lot the right thing that we need? And so how do we then begin to make recommendations with regards to those particular programs and services that may be missing? Our kinship and foster care group is led by our Child Welfare Bureau Chief, Tina Jefferson, and our internal lead is, external lead, thank you, Commissioner. Our external lead is Randy Rubin Rodriguez. She's the president and co-founder of Our Kids, and so they are starting to really look at our opportunities to enhance the work that you guys have already began, specific to kinship. Looking at what are our barriers to being able to do more kinship? What supports are missing in our system to be able to help our caregivers thrive? Really doing a full analysis around what else can we expand upon, Bill? How do we bring into the fold not just those kids who are placed with kin specific to dependency, but what about those that's in a kinship arrangement, if you will, through the probate process? And so where are our opportunities there? We're also taking a look in that group with regards to kinship navigated programs, because that's a specific funding that's allowed under Family First. And so in their initial cut and review of that, what we found is the state of Connecticut actually have threads, if you will, of navigator components across our state in different departments and agencies, but what we don't have is a cohesive kinship navigator program that will benefit our population. So unless someone is successful in getting a program approved on the clearinghouse that we could maybe consider, evaluate, and select, we may be put in a posture where we have to design a program that works best for our kids as determined by the populations that we decide. So they have their work cut out for them, but they've had 2 meetings to date and we'll meet again on this Friday. So fiscal and revenue enhancement, I say that's the fun group, because they have the pleasure of taking what the candidacy population defines and create. And I wanted to let you guys know, we didn't arbitrarily start our conversations about candidacy about what we think and feel. it was important to us to really do a data analysis review of what the numbers tell us with regards to populations. We did some exercises specific to what entry points are folks starting to access and come into the system, because we really wanted it to be driven by data as opposed to emotion, because as social workers, sometimes we can be emotional beings. I think we can be honest about that. But this is huge when we start thinking about how are we going to be fair and equitable and trying to figure out the who. So fiscal will have the pleasure of hearing what our candidacy population is, who we hand out to our services and programs group. They then have to come up with the array that kind of maps to that system, and then we're going to say, hey, fiscal, can you fund this for us? So many times systems and programs start with the dollars first, and so we have been very intentional in saying, don't think about the money. I'm sure Cindy's like, Joshonda, stop saying that. But don't think about the money. Let's really think about what do we need in terms of our populations and our service, build that, design that, and then if we're working across systems intentionally the way we say we want to, then we have to figure it out, because a lot of systems other than DCF have money. A lot of these systems serve the same families, but in different ways, and so we really have to roll up our sleeves and figure out how do we get creative and innovative in terms of how we thread that together for the benefits of families. So that is the charge of that group that is led by Cindy Butterfield, our fiscal manager at DCF, and Dr. Allison Blake, who is an executive director of one of our agencies locally, previously commissioner for the state of New Jersey. So I think that there is a strong team there, and they too have had 2 meetings today. Our last group is community partnerships and family engagements, and while we have been very intentional in making sure that we have folks with lived experiences represented on all of the work groups, this is our powerhouse group. So if you have interest in, say, a little bit of everything, most of those folks have migrated to this particular group. So it is a lot of folks with lived experience. A lot of our community providers are on this group. We also have some cross sections of state agencies. Office of Early Learning is represented. DMV is represented on that group. Education was present yesterday, so that was good. Granted, it was one of the county commission school boards, but we are really trying to make sure that everyone is at the table because they are the voice of hearing what's going on in the other group. They also are championed to be our ambassadors for change. So they're the ones that's going to be helping us go out to thread the message in local communities and their provider agencies and in various systems about what Family First is, as well as what it is not, because as you all can imagine and think, there's definitely been some misconceptions as to what this will do. And so we have this group engaged with us to be able to hopefully communicate well. And so our leaders for this particular group are Beresford Wilson from Favor, as well as Tim Marshall, who is our Director of Mental Health for the state of Connecticut. So I know that was in rapid fire speed, but I know folks are going to be ready to leave shortly. Ken is going to kind of come in and wrap up the tail end of the conversation, but hopefully we'll have a few minutes left for questions if you guys have them. So thank you.
Was that rapid fire or was that rapid fire? I'm so thrilled I stand between you and leaving. So we have about 45 minutes left. We'll be fine. Question and answer session. So I wanted to impart to everybody what the community's role has been so far in our Family First work. The biggest piece that I think we have learned is that the community now is eager. We have over 200 different community partners that have stepped up to be a part of our kickoff and are now represented on the individual work groups. I chose the word partners, though, very deliberately. We do not just have our contracted providers. We have sister state agencies. We have independent therapists who have their own shops. We have individuals from the education section. We have youth. We have some families, individuals with lived experience, and grassroots organizations that do not receive any funding from a state entity. We have individuals literally every day that are emailing us, raising their hand to say, I want to be a part of the Family First work. And as Joshonda gave it voice, and I want to put emphasis on this, Family First is a tool that we are now utilizing to enhance our system, while at the same time, we are looking comprehensively at all of those avenues, those pockets in our communities, where we can strengthen our prevention efforts to help children, to keep children not just out of foster care, but I believe, as Dr. Milner indicated earlier, to keep them even from coming to our attention. And this is a massive undertaking. We continue to state to our partners that we are the Child Protective Services Agency, but we're not the Child Protective Services system. That we are taking, we meaning the individuals in this room, are taking too much on our shoulders. And this is a great opportunity to join and to partner and to break down those barriers that we have with our partners, to develop a system with them that is comprehensive and thorough with them, not their system and our system, but all of our system. Why did we deliberately start with our providers to give them the external kickoff and to hear from them their thoughts on the system? We were actually asked that question yesterday in one of our work group meetings, and the answer was pretty clear. We believe as a state, we already have embedded in our work so many of the principles that Family First stands for. Michael talked about it earlier with the progression of initiatives that are now part of the way of life and the culture of our agency, from reducing the number of children in care, to the belief that children are best served in their own families, to be raised by their own families. The fact that we now have 45% of our youth in out-of-home care in kinship care. We have approximately 6 or 7% of our youth in out-of-home care in congregate care. The belief of keeping children at home, and if they cannot remain at home, place them with kin. And if they need a treatment option, not a placement, but if they need treatment, to consider congregate care, are core principles of Family First. And so we're going to build upon those, and we've imparted those to our community providers, partners. And what have they said? Overwhelming support for the philosophy. They also recognize that keeping children at home and in the least restrictive placement is what they stand for as well. But we're going to be challenged during this process. At times, our partners take a different path towards keeping children safe. But yet, at times, as we know, when we become risk adverse, we want them to choose our path, thinking our path is the best. And they say, listen to us. But most importantly, the families that we have with us on this journey are informing us of what they think is best for them. We also know that our community partners do believe the state has a solid infrastructure and a great base of services already to build upon. For those of us that have had the privilege and the honor, I'm looking at Jodi because I know she goes to a number of different states, as much as we think we don't have in Connecticut, what we have is tremendous compared to other places. Our challenge now is to coordinate and to build upon what we have, instead of trying to figure out maybe necessarily what we can get more of, but to do better and to collaborate, in fact, what we already have. We know as well that our Family First work is actually 2 phases. Right now, we are in the planning stage. We are working at lightning speed to put together a statewide comprehensive prevention plan. Then becomes maybe even the harder work. It's the implementation stage. And we have every intention to continue these work groups, to continue the partner involvement, to continue having families come to us and giving us their voice and listening to our youth from this point moving forward. Family First is not an initiative, it's not a thing, it's not a bunch of words on a PowerPoint. This is the new way in which we are going to operate in the state and across the country. Family First is a tool in the new way in which we believe we can help children and families comprehensively. Now, let's hit some issues very head on. What are some of the anticipated challenges? I think I talked about a few of these earlier. That risk aversion tendency. What are we worried about? We know what we're worried about, and we know what our providers are worried about. They're worried about a child fatality. They're worried about being on the cover of the Hartford Courant. They're worried about losing their contract. Okay, deliberately, Joshonda and I met with, yesterday, in our community partnership group, with Tim and Barrett taking the lead. We purposely brought up and facilitated a conversation about how to break down the risk-adverse tendencies that we have in our communities. And all the issues you described here, and hearing Dr. Milner and the conversations he's had with other programs across the country, all were voiced in that room with us yesterday. What are we all worried about? We know what we're worried about, making the wrong decision. Yet, if we use this process correctly, with the people we have at the table, and if we listen, they listen to us, yeah, you know what? We will celebrate our successes. We will support ourselves when something perhaps negative happens. We will learn and become a healthier system when things perhaps don't go the way that we want them to. And in an overarching way, we will all be stronger at the end of the day. But yet it's interesting to hear this conversation and to know less than 24 hours ago, we were having a concurrent conversation with our providers and our partners, and the same conversations and the same concerns were right there. We know that there is a collective impact on Child Protective Services. This is our opportunity, and we've already started it with our Child and Family Services Plan, to embed our work across state agencies to align all systems and services. We had the commissioner of DMV at one of our meetings. I checked my license to make sure it wasn't expired, and that was good, right? But think about that. DMV, DDS, DSS, the state police, State Department of Ed, OEC, are sending multiple individuals to partner with us, along with multiple individuals from other agencies. Yes, this is going to mean service model changes. Yes, this may mean for some of our providers that they are going to be put in a position to change their business model. Pause for a minute and think about where we were 10 years ago. 7,000 kids in care, congregate, congregate, congregate. And what did we say, right? We're going to push kinship care. We're going to keep children out of the high-end placements. And what did our partners say? You can't do that, right? And some of those providers who pushed back are now no longer with us. You knew what I was going to say. He's heard it all before too, right? But what happens? Those providers who realize that times are changing, what's best for kids is to keep them out of the high-end placements with individuals that they know, and to partner with us, are now stronger than ever. We don't have a plan right now or a list of partners or providers and all the shifts that may occur. That's not what we're trying to impart here. But the reality is that we have talked to our community partners that there are going to be shifts in business models and shifts in programs and more of this and less of this, because overall we believe that's better for children and families. And we will do that in as professional and ethical way based on a comprehensive plan that they themselves have had significant input into. We also know one of the challenges is certainly going to be communication and the speed of change. We are doing this in lightning speed when other states have taken a year and a half to do. Partner community is saying, wait a minute, you're doing this so quick, do you already have a plan in mind? Are we just going through the motions? And we had to dispel some of those myths the other day. It's interesting that the community thinks we're doing something too quick. Typically it's what? Come on, right, hurry up, right? Another year goes by, right? So we recognize that communication is huge. We have an excellent website that we have set up internally that we'll talk about in a little bit. And we're posting meeting dates, minutes, videos. Today's entire presentation all day has been videotaped. We're going to talk about internal communication plans for all of you to impart this information down to your staff. And likewise, through my division and my bureau, we're going to develop very consistent, probably every other week communications back out to our external partners to make sure that we, in a clear and concise way, are communicating the most appropriate information to everybody in the same way, so the communication does not get skewed in any way. lastly, why is all of this worth it? Why are we here? Why have we been here all day? Why do we meet morning, noon, and night about Family First? Absolutely, when we align our services in the most comprehensive way possible, with a heavy emphasis on evidence-based practices, we know that parents are going to be better equipped, supported, and trained to raise their own children. Stop that cycle of child abuse and neglect, stop the intergenerational cycle, come to us, and that will then also, when we see the results of our families and how they're helped, I reflect back on what Michael Williams said earlier today about our public value. We can dramatically increase our public value and be viewed as helping the better we align our services with the right services at the right time. We also know that when children stay home, or if they can't stay home, they're with kin, children maintain their culture, their connection to community ties, all those things that we blurted out earlier with our one-word thoughts when Jeremy was up earlier and questioning us about what we would want our system to look like. We also know then for our direct line staff, they're going to have better resources and tools and services to assist these efforts. And they will feel so much better about the work, and you will feel so much better about the work. It will become a much more positive and cyclical cycle. Last piece here is, again, we want to emphasize, we have so many pieces of our infrastructure now that are embedded with our Family First principles. We are continuing to build upon all those prior efforts that we made over the past 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to get here. And part of the reason why we now have chosen to opt into Family First by October 1st, 2020 is because we feel we are right and we are ready and we have the structure in place. Is it going to mean significant effort to get there? Absolutely. Joshonda, when we introduced her, we didn't do justice to how tremendous Joshonda has been as an asset in her very, very short time here in Connecticut. And I also want to give our partners so much credit. They are spending hours with us, realigning their own schedules, being honest. The challenge for all of us in this room is to seize the opportunity now to take a look at our system, be open and honest in what we think and what we want it to look like, implement what we can at particular stages along the way. But while that's going on, we have got to listen to our families, to our youth, and our partners that are at the table. When we do this right, not if, when we do this right, we will be able to shape our service delivery system, the entire Child Protective Services system in Connecticut for decades to come. All right. All right. ctfamilyfirst.ct.gov, ctfamilyfirst.ct.gov. You will see there the master meeting schedule, all the minutes, all the videos, PowerPoints, handouts, the 2 approved federal plans, all the information about our work so far. If you are in this room and interested in joining a work group, you need to have that cleared with your direct supervisor, and then send us an email on our specific CT Family First email address. That's also in your packet, so we can ensure continuity and ensure that you are properly receiving the messages. Who's got a question?
Hi, this is a comment, not a question. Commissioner, I would just like to thank you and the executive team for bringing us together today. I think that the information that we heard and the direction of the agency is one that many of us are all of us should be excited, but many of us are excited and have long awaited. And so I want to thank you for pulling us together today. I would especially like to thank you for the surprise of having Jerry Milner here. I think that, really thank you to the organization of that. Dr. Milner, thank you for coming up. I think most importantly, having Dr. Milner here today really sends a message to us as a leadership in the department that you value us and the work that we do to bring someone as inspirational and important to us to talk with us. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody. Thank you.
Chris.
I just wanted to go off of what Chris said, and I think that having Dr. Milner, Jerry, speak directly to our staff would be incredible.
So the video, he's coming back. The video that we referenced that pretty much captures almost with the same level of intensity that he delivered here in person is available to you all if you want to use that as the mechanism to kind of help deliver that piece of the message. I know it's a lot more impactful to have him here in person, but then thinking about kind of how you spread that across the country and I don't know his ability to come back to Connecticut, but I do know in the interim, before we can get him back, we can also use that as in its proper.
How do we get the video?
We can give you. It's posted. Yeah. Oh, it's posted in the website that's in the packet that you have.
We'll send out a formal announcement to everybody, exactly with all the links.
To everything.
You can go into the videos.
Yeah. So, like I said, there's about 200 of us in the room, and there's 3,000 of us across the state that work for this department. This call to action that you heard today can't stay in this room. It's your responsibility to help carry the water. I can't impress upon you enough. And I've said this a couple of times, but I want to reinforce that. When people say to you, what are they doing up there? You cannot say, I don't know. Because it undermines your credibility as leaders. If you don't know the exact answer, hopefully we've given you enough information today to be able to say, let me get that answer for you, or we're working in this direction, or it aligns with this. We are doing our very best to eliminate the duplicity of our work. We're doing the very best to eliminate things that have no value add. We're doing the very best to eliminate things that don't contribute to our aspirational targets. And it's up to you to lift those things up and say to us, do you realize we're still collecting whatever that is, so we can start to take those things off your plate. I heard somebody earlier say that as we start to have this kind of hybrid centralized structure of some of our leaders, they're starting to see where there are things inconsistent across the board and say maybe we don't need to do it that way anymore, or somebody else has already started to do things differently. Carrying the message means carrying all of it, that we are a work in progress, and that it's our job as a collective leadership team to be able to make sure that we inspire hope in our staff. If they believe that we're just willy-nilly snow globe shaking things up, they won't buy into any of this. So you guys have to be the message bearers. Dare to be a better leader than you were yesterday. Stop comparing ourselves to everybody else and compare ourselves to ourselves. Give yourself permission to refocus, re-energize, and be excited about the work that we do. Because I know why I came to social work. And then when I look up, it's 27 years later, and I say, how did we get here? Lift each other up. Lift each other up. We have enough people holding us down and enough people talking about our system as if they know. Continue to help each other. Continue to share the good news widely and often. I'm not rose-colored glasses. Vannessa's not just only seeing things with the glass half full. Our families deserve us to have optimism about what we do. If we kind of continue to describe ourselves in the adjectives that we heard that kids and families will describe our system, we'll continue to stay in the place that we were. Take care of yourselves in order to take care of others. Help the people who help the people. And I can't wait for us to get back together again. Today has just been enormously fulfilling for me from a very selfish way, because this is like my extended family. You guys, this has just been like a reunion today. We have to do more of this. I'd like to thank the executive team. Of course, I'd like to thank our Casey partners and Dr. Milner to be able to join us. And what I say is a rebirth of the reasons why we came to this work.